September morning, America honors the victims of 9/11.
Lee Allen Adler.
Thousands gather at Ground Zero to salute the innocent civilians and the heroes in uniform who died trying to save them. At a newly restored Pentagon, headquarters for the war on terror, and in Pennsylvania, where a field becomes a national shrine to bravery. Plus, a 60 Minutes 2 exclusive one-on-one with the President of the United States.
I felt the same now as I did then, which was sad. And I still feel sad for those who grieve for their families.
Tonight, special coverage of a day of remembrance, a year of recovery, and a nation's new resolve to defend freedom. 1 year after the attack on America.
This is a special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News. 9/11, the day that changed America. From Ground Zero in New York, here is Dan Rather.
September 11th, 2001. It's been one long year, but it seems like only yesterday. Good evening from the pit and the Circle of Honor at Ground Zero in New York City. 1 year ago tonight, the scene behind me resembled something like the ninth circle of Dante's Hell. A mountain of smoldering rubble, twisted steel, and shattered glass. The 110-story twin towers of the World Trade Center destroyed by terrorist murderers who turned commercial jetliners into guided missiles against innocent people. A desperate search was underway then for anyone who might have survived. In the end, 2,801 people died here. 184 more at the Pentagon, 40 in a Pennsylvania field. Today, America renewed the promise we made that day, that we will never forget. Perhaps better than any poet could, the simple, mournful cry of the bagpipes spoke the grief felt by a city and a nation today. The bagpipe stopped at 8:46 a.m., exactly 1 year to the minute that the first plane struck and the world changed forever. And then there was silence. At the White House, President Bush shared in the unspoken tribute to the dead.
Lawrence Christopher Abel. Alona Abraham.
In New York, former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani began to speak the names, each one a life lived and lost. It is, a horror and an outrage so vast that 2 hours later, they were still reading.
Salvatore Zisa.
At the Pentagon, different names, but the same immeasurable loss. And at a once unremarkable field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, they honored the memory of the passengers and heroes of United Flight 93. The day that shook the world was observed around the world. In Venice, a floating tribute to America's dead. In London, falling rose petals and a royal remembrance. Late this afternoon, President Bush came to Ground Zero to pay his respects. But when today's music and speeches have faded, the people who survived the horror here will be left with their own vivid and indelible memories.
Where were you when the plane hit?
Michael Benfante was on his way down that day from the 81st floor when he heard a cry for help.
When I saw this woman sitting in a wheelchair, and I just looked her right in the eye and I said, "Do you need help?" And she said yes.
I got her in the strap wheelchair and just carried her down the steps. And
as it turns out, Michael had been telling his story to CBS News that day when the South Tower collapsed. That's Michael Benfante fleeing.
Wave of debris came over, and everything just went black.
As soon as I had stepped off the elevator, that's when the first plane hit. And before I knew it, I was just engulfed in this intense heat.
Manu Dhingra managed to get down 83 flights with burns over 40% of his body. Not a day goes by that he doesn't remember that he's one of the lucky ones.
There are 3,000 people who would switch places with me in a heartbeat, so...
I wasn't working that day.
When fireman Zach Fletcher saw smoke in the sky, he radioed his twin brother, fireman Andre Fletcher.
He gets back to me and says, "What, are you kidding me?" He says, "Aren't you listening to the news?"
Before long, both brothers were racing to the scene.
"I'll be looking for you." And that's the last thing I heard from him. He said, "I'll be looking for you too," and that was that.
1 year ago, CBS's Byron Pitts was one of the first reporters here at Ground Zero witnessing the horror. He returned today to a much different scene.
Long before dawn, the hymns of history for a nation that suffered before filled the streets of New York City. 250 bagpipers and drummers marched through the streets of New York's 5 boroughs. 19 miles soldier straight from the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, Manhattan. A walk for their friends they lost from the neighborhoods where they lived to the place where they died. On this day, Ground Zero, a hole 7 stories deep, seemed holy, and silence screamed. Moments of silence marking the times jets became bombs and America went to war. New York's mayor spoke.
Again today, we are a nation that mourns.
The governor read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
77 years ago.
And then the names.
Paul Aquaviva.
The names of all 2,801 men and women, sons and daughters, killed on September 11, 2001. A teenage girl spoke of the stepfather she lost, a child with a woman's wisdom that grows only out of grief.
You were the best father I could ever ask for. I miss you, and I hope you didn't hurt too much. Love, Marianne.
10:29, church bells sounded citywide, and all stood still. 10:29 a.m., that was the moment the second tower fell. Relatives of the dead walked down the 500-foot ramp by the thousands to the bottom of the pit. They left roses. They took soil. Organizers planned a day of sobering reflection. No grand speeches, no singing, no surprises. Security on the ground, at sea, in the air. But Mother Nature proved again, she likes surprises. A gust of wind cut across Ground Zero. A dust cloud filled the sky. For a moment, it was difficult to breathe. But during that moment, say many of the relatives and friends, that cloud brought comfort.
It's like all of our loved ones rising up. In a way, letting us know they're still here.
Peggy Garbarini's brother, New York City Fire Department Lieutenant Charlie Garbarini, died at Ground Zero. One of the 2,801 souls President Bush came to honor. Ground Zero 1 year later, for those who lost loved ones, it still feels like yesterday.
Police estimate 24,000 people were here this morning. Many said it was hard to show up, even harder to go home. Dan?
Byron Pitts reporting live from here at Ground Zero. Thanks. At the Pentagon today, also a day of rededication, but much more than that. CBS News national security correspondent David Martin reports on the nerve center of America's global war against terrorism.
For a second time, a flag was unfurled from the roof of the Pentagon. A ceremonial replay of the flag firefighters had unfurled the day after the attack. And the Secretary of Defense conjured up images of an earlier war with phrases that echoed Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
We're here today to honor those who died in this place and to rededicate ourselves to the cause for which they gave their lives.
189 people died on this battlefield, but the Pentagon has risen from the ashes thanks to a $500 million reconstruction project by some 3,000 workers. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs called hard hat patriots.
You've restored this great building ahead of schedule with muscle, determination, marble, cement, and Indiana limestone. You did more than repair our windows and walls. You repaired our souls.
7,000 miles away in Afghanistan, where the U.S. still has 9,500 troops, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division ended another sweep through southeastern Afghanistan. One more operation in a war with no end in sight, although Secretary Rumsfeld claimed that in one sense, the terrorists have already lost.
They were defeated because they failed utterly to achieve their objectives. The terrorists wanted September 11th to be a day when innocents died. Instead, it was a day when heroes were born.
The ceremony was moving and the rebuilt Pentagon is impressive. But the reality of a nation on edge is grim. Anti-aircraft radars and missile batteries stationed around Washington. Police boats patrolling the Potomac River. A fighter jet circling low over the ceremony for the airliner that crashed in Pennsylvania.
In Pakistan, 5 men were arrested on suspicion of planning attacks against American fast food outlets. In Europe, several American embassies and consulates had to close after receiving letters containing an unidentified white powder. Closer to home, a suspicious Liberian flag container ship was held off the coast of New Jersey while nuclear detection teams tried to track down traces of radioactivity they had picked up on an initial inspection.
Those last 2 incidents are still being investigated, so we don't know yet whether Al-Qaeda attempted any attacks today. But clearly, the U.S. is a much harder target to hit today than it was 1 year ago. Dan?
Live at the Pentagon, David Martin. Unlike the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, the third site of remembrance today was not where a building stood. It was where brave air passengers and crew took a stand against the murderers. CBS's Mark Strassman is at the Field of Honor in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Mark?
Dan, like Gettysburg, Shanksville is now a remote stretch of western Pennsylvania that has become hallowed ground. This is where United Flight 93 went down, and this is also now where America rose up. In their shared sorrow, relatives of the 40 people lost aboard Flight 93 turned again to that moment of mid-air heroics and found their own strength in numbers.
Jason Dahl.
Captain Jason Dahl was Flight 93's
Leroy
pilot,
Homer Jr.
Sandy Dahl's husband.
After September 11th, we know there is no shortage of angels.
And kid brother of 3 grieving siblings.
Jason was the cheerleader for the Dahl family. He's the one that made sure everybody got together.
And now in Shanksville, he does again.
You get to the crash site and you went, it's all real. And it really hits you.
Hits all of Flight 93's extended family.
They thought we would simply stand aside. And early on the morning of September 11th, in the skies above us, they got their answer.
This is the cratered and protected impact point. The coroner walks families through their grief and the knee-deep grass. On Flight 93, America began to fight back. Now Shanksville has become a shrine to a united flight and a united fight.
I think that this is something that'll live with us till we die.
That something leaves a wound still raw.
It's going to take a lot of years.
Especially the way it happened. It's going to take a lot of years.
A chorus of 40 families echoes that. Relatives of Flight 93's volunteer citizen soldiers. A bill now on Capitol Hill would make this field officially a national memorial. Then again, Americans don't need an act of Congress to salute an act of courage. Dan?
Mark Strassman, live in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. President Bush will meet the 9/11 anniversary and mark it with an address to the nation at 9 o'clock Eastern Time this evening. He will be speaking then from Ellis Island, over the years the gateway to the United States of America for so many immigrants seeking freedom. CBS News Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has early word on some of what the president plans to say.
With the nation's most powerful symbol of liberty as his backdrop, President Bush will measure freedom's cost in his speech tonight, saying, for those who lost loved ones, it has been a year of sorrow, of empty places, of newborn children who will never know their fathers here on earth. Mr. Bush will also speak of how America has changed in the wake of 9/11. For all Americans, it has been a year of adjustment, he'll say, of coming to terms with the difficult knowledge that our nation has determined enemies and that we are not invulnerable to their attack. He will also remind the nation what is at stake, and as he did earlier at the Pentagon, he will rededicate himself to carry that campaign forward.
And as long as terrorists and dictators plot against our lives and our liberty, they will be opposed by the United States Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and Marines.
On 9/11, the threat was clear and clearly deadly. But as the president looks toward the next front in the war on terror, a possible attack on Iraq, the case is muddled. No one is certain what Saddam has, though they do know what he is capable of doing. The tough job for Mr. Bush is to convince the world that we cannot afford to wait to find out.
You have to have a clear definition of the threat before you go to the solution. And I'm not sure all Americans and the world especially agree with the definition of the threat of Saddam Hussein.
Before a skeptical United Nations tomorrow, President Bush will make his case against Saddam, arguing that Iraq is an outlaw regime that has defied UN resolutions for 11 years while aggressively pursuing weapons of mass destruction. He will ask, what more does the world need to know about Saddam to realize the threat he poses to peace and stability? While he will not present detailed evidence of Saddam's weapons programs, he will say in the most pointed terms that Saddam Hussein has thumbed his nose at UN authority and that the UN is duty-bound to rein him in.
Are we going to let the world be turned over to a bunch of thugs and murderers and ruthless dictators? Is that the kind of world that we are going to preside over and let happen?
Later tonight, in time for the morning shows and the morning editions, the White House will release a 20-page document titled Iraq, a Decade of Defiance, outlining U.S. accusations of Iraqi brutality, repression, and defiance of UN resolutions to, as the White House said, help the world better understand why President Bush is so concerned. Dan?
John Roberts here at the World Financial Center, just across from Ground Zero. President Bush talked at length about the attack on America in an exclusive interview with CBS News correspondent Scott Pelley for tonight's 60 Minutes 2. Scott's here tonight at Ground Zero to tell us something about that. Scott?
Dan, for the first time on television, the president's talking about September 11th and the week we went to war. What's remarkable about the interview is just how moved the president is by his memories, even 1 year later.
One of our interviews with the president was on board Air Force One. Here, he told us about his trip to New York 3 days after the attacks, when he met with families who still had hope of seeing their loved ones again.
People said to me, he'll come out, don't worry, Mr. President. We'll see him soon. I know my loved one. He'll find a place to survive underneath the rubble, and we'll get him out. But I remember the whole time thinking, this is incredibly sad because the loved ones won't come out.
I'm told a story, Mr. President, of a little boy who handed you a picture of his father in his firefighter uniform.
Right.
And you signed it and handed it back, and he burst into tears. Do you remember that young man?
I do. I remember a lot of young boys. When they started to get me to sign the picture, I said, your daddy won't believe that I was here, so you show him that autograph. Just trying to provide a little hope.
It's a difficult time to be with those.
It was tough, you know. I still get emotional thinking about it because we're dealing with people who loved their dads or loved their mom, loved their wives who loved their husbands. It was a tough time. You know, and it was a tough time for all of us because we were very emotional, and I was emotional at times. I felt the same now as I did then, which was sad, and I still feel sad for those who grieve for their families. But as I said, out of my tears, I see opportunity.
We also spoke with the president recently at the White House, where we asked him about the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
After a year, we still don't have Osama bin Laden.
How do you know that? Look, I don't know whether Osama bin Laden is dead or alive. I don't know that. He's not leading a lot of parades. This is much bigger than one person anyway. This is, we're slowly but surely dismantling and disrupting an Al-Qaeda network that hates America.
With today's Code Orange alert, it's important to note that the president told us in the interview that he believes we're safer at home 1 year later. But he acknowledges the war on terror is not over, and he told us that it's an international manhunt now, tracking the terrorists one at a time. Dan?
Scott, we look forward to the rest of the interview and the other interviews with top administration officials tonight. You can see much more of Scott's interview with President Bush on 60 Minutes 2 tonight at 8/7 Central. That'll be just before the president's address to the nation. Coming up next on this special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News from Ground Zero. What are the chances Al-Qaeda will attack the U.S. again, and where? For the first time since 9/11, the FBI's counter-terrorism chief answers those questions in a Jim Stewart exclusive interview. Back now live from Ground Zero. The nation remains tonight on Code Orange, meaning officially high risk of a possible terrorist attack. The government's own experts believe terrorists will try to strike again. CBS News correspondent Jim Stewart has an exclusive interview this evening with a man who's in a position to know.
A year ago today, this rarely seen complex of rooms was arguably the most important place in America. With the Pentagon on fire and the White House evacuated, much of the U.S. government fled here last September the 11th.
It was a busy, busy time.
To the vault-like, sealed-off command center of the FBI.
I don't know what the legal limit is in here, but there's probably hundreds of people around here.
Dale Watson, the head of the FBI's Counter-terrorism division, was at the center of the storm that day, and now, in his only broadcast interview since then, has a sobering assessment for the future. On a scale of 1 to 10, Watson rates the terrorist threat level today at 8 and climbing.
As the threat decreased, it has not decreased that much where we were from last year at this time.
First and foremost, he believes U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East are a prime target.
Would that be a crown jewel, so to speak? Absolutely.
While inside the U.S., the city of Washington is unfinished business for Al-Qaeda.
The United States Capitol area is a target that people that really hate us as an organization and what we stand for would be a likely target.
But what's left of Al-Qaeda to press the attack? Not nearly as much as before, says Watson, who personally believes Osama bin Laden is dead and confirmed the U.S. is examining corpses to prove it.
You have Osama bin Laden's DNA.
Osama bin Laden's a Saudi citizen, and there are a lot of ways to get DNA.
Al-Qaeda's middle leadership may be taking over the reins, especially this man, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who helped plan 9/11.
That's still the man, right?
Yeah. Oh,
I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, he's the man.
You're not mistaken.
Right.
While inside the U.S., Watson confirmed the FBI is following and surveilling far more suspected terrorists than previously reported.
Are there 5,000? We don't have 5,000 cases.
Can you give me a dimension?
Are there several hundred that we're looking at? On any given time, yes, there are.
As for the attack itself, who decided to turn hijacked planes into guided missiles? No one here knows. How did the hijackers get in the cockpits? Watson's not sure, but thinks the pilots themselves may have opened the doors for breakfast.
Pilot, co-pilot, probably wanted a cup of coffee.
Or more puzzling, what was Mohammed Atta, the hijacker ringleader, doing on repeated visits to Las Vegas?
What's he doing out there? Why does he fly out there first class and then stay in a lower-priced hotel? How long was he there? These are all...
Again, no answers, only questions. But the thinking in this room is that Washington and New York are not alone on Al-Qaeda's all-American hit list. Jim Stewart, CBS News, Washington.
Coming up next here on the CBS Evening News, the New York City Fire Department, 1 year later, still struggling to get back on its feet. 1 year after the attack on America, the Fire Department of New York is still struggling to recover from its devastating losses. But even on this anniversary, even as they mourn, there's a job to be done. And as CBS's Jim Axelrod reports, the men and women known as New York's bravest are doing it.
What Engine Company 23 went through in 1 hour this morning is what the entire department has lived with for the last 12 months. Even as they prepared for their firehouse memorial.
EMS, 5, 6, and 5th Ave, pedestrian struck.
There was business to take care of. First handling a rescue call, then rushing back to the firehouse to remember the 6 firefighters this company lost.
Lieutenant Charles Gabarini, firefighter Mark Whitford, are no longer with us.
It's a divided life Captain John Bendick has come to accept.
It's like anything else in your heart, it's stuck back there. And every once in a while, you get that little trigger, and you think about it. But basically, you have to go on.
A year later, the fire department faces enormous obstacles. Collectively, the 343 killed had 4,400 years of experience. On top of that, hundreds of firefighters retired after 9/11, and hundreds more may soon have to leave due to lung damage from working at Ground Zero.
September 11th put me in a state of mind where I was
I was hungry to be in this position.
Replacing them are rookies, probies they're called, like Danny Cintron. A year later, the department is probie heavy, hoping attitude will carry them until experience takes over.
It's not a decision. You do it because that's what you're meant to do.
The probies join a department facing tough questions about communication and coordination failures that hindered rescue efforts a year ago.
We certainly have learned from 9/11, and we're not nearly where we want to be, but we're much further along than people give us credit for.
9/11 changed police work as well. Today, the Port Authority remembered 37 of its officers whose job it was to keep the trade centers safe.
James Leahy.
The NYPD honored 23 of its own. And while both agencies say they too were learning lessons, Jan Vigiano, a mother who lost 2 sons, a firefighter and a cop, has trouble finding anything positive.
Forget about normal life. There's no such thing, and there will never be. But, you know, everything is taken away from us. We have nothing.
In the name of the Father. A year later, balancing that despair with the search for meaning may be New York's biggest challenge. For firefighters like Danny Cintron, it means never concentrating fully on either.
If we know we're going to a fire, our demeanor is, I gotta go.
I gotta go. Not a bad motto for the city's firefighters and police officers. Those taken a year ago today, and those still here. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, New York.
Some CBS stations will be going now to local news. If you're leaving us, we invite you to come back later this evening for 60 Minutes 2 with Scott Pelley's interview with President Bush. For the rest of you, this extended CBS Evening News will continue in just a moment, so stay with us.
This is CBS.